Well, we are going to get started. And I want to just tell you, yes, this is recorded. This is not my medium of choice. So if it's awful, then we're going to re-record it and post the link. But we wanted to give you all an opportunity to ask questions here. And as we have always want to communicate what's going on, and we said that we would as we know certain things. And we do know certain things. So we are well on the way to implementing some major changes. I'm going to share my slide, and we are my slide deck, and we are ready to go. And of course, as everybody knows, on March 15th, NAR entered into a settlement agreement with in the Burnett class action antitrust lawsuit in Missouri. It was a nationwide settlement agreement. And there were really three major pieces to that. The first was the financial payout of $418 million. If you are curious and want to know the details about who's involved and who got excluded and all that kind of stuff, all of that can be found on nar.realtor/the-facts. We're not going to go into all the details of all of the settlement terms and all the benefits and whatnot. So we're going to focus on the other two items, which were the terms. And the first of those was that MLS participants must have a written buyer agreement prior to showing a listing. And when we talk about MLS participants, we're talking about the principal broker and all affiliated licensees. And then the third major theme was that MLSs must eliminate offers of compensation in the MLS. So fortunately, we have expertise here. Brian Schneider is our attorney, and sorry, there we go. Brian, sorry, Julie, do you want to see what Renee, can you help Renee? Keeps raising her hand.
Yeah, I'm going to send her a message.
Okay, thank you. All right. So Brian's been our attorney for quite some time, and fortunately, he represents a lot of MLSs and realtor associations around the country, and he's been involved with all these antitrust lawsuits for a while. Since we have not been involved directly in these, he's just provided counsel for us, but he is a wise and pragmatic person. So I always like to get advice from folks who are practical. So he is with the law firm Aaron Fox Schiff in DC, and he wanted to just give a little update on where we are in the settlement.
Sure. Thanks, Stuart. Good afternoon, everyone. Real quick, just to give everyone a sense of sort of where we are in the timeline. So the settlement has been what's called preliminarily approved. So the judge has looked it over, heard arguments about whether or not it's a fair deal for the class members, those home sellers who are part of the class, and said, yes, on balance, this all seems fair. I'm going to preliminarily approve it. What happens now is that notices go out to home sellers around the country. So there'll be websites, postcards in the mail, and home sellers are going to have the opportunity, anybody who sold a home essentially anywhere in the last 6 to 8 years, depending on where they live in the country, will get to fill out a form. Here's the home I sold, and here's how much I'm claiming in the settlement. They also have an opportunity to object and say why they think this settlement is not good. And they also have an opportunity to opt out and say, I don't even want to be part of this settlement. I'm going to get my own lawyer and figure this out myself. The vast majority of home sellers will opt in, will submit their claim. And then in November, after Thanksgiving, there'll be a hearing by the judge to review all those comments and finalize the settlement for what's called a final approval. Once that happens, the settlement is final, it's approved, all the terms are in place, the payments start going out to home sellers, and for everyone on this video and watching, it means that we can all start moving on and realize that the cases are going to slowly get dismissed by the sort of end of the year, early next year, so that we can all get back to our businesses. Sure.
Let me unmute. All right. So thank you so much. And I'll be calling on you as we go through this. So
Sure.
again, those are the three major themes. Let's just dive into these. Who's going to be responsible? So we went to NAR a few weeks back, and this was the question: who's responsible for enforcement of all these settlement terms? And the short answer was the MLSs and agents and brokers. So we are always the tip of the spear, and so we're going to take it on with a smile on our face. So let's talk about these buyer agreements. So the buyer agreements are required to be signed prior to touring a home. So that would mean that physically entering the home with a client or a customer, and also a live virtual tour if you are in the home and you are projecting a virtual tour to someone who is remote. So that is considered touring a home. So those buyer agreements have to be signed prior to that. A point of clarification on all this: these mandatory agreements in the settlement focus on compensation and not on agency. And that's important because your buyer agreement may or may not establish an agency relationship. So any type of agreement that complies with state law are acceptable as long as they have these terms in it that focus on compensation. And excuse me, as a side note, Tennessee Realtors Forms Committee is working very hard on its standard buyer agreements and looking for, so look to them for more information about, if you use the Tennessee forms. They're working on those. It seems like every day. So we should have more information as those come out. So there are some required items in the buyer agreements that deal with the compensation. So the first one is that they must state conspicuously the specific amount or rate of compensation the buyer's broker will receive, or how this amount will be determined. So it must be objective and not open-ended. And so, Brian, I'm going to turn to you and have you maybe expound on what objective and not open-ended means.
Yeah, this is a pretty common question that's coming up. The example that the settlement agreement expressly gives is it can't say, I'll get paid whatever's offered by the other side broker, or I'll get paid whatever we can negotiate, or I'll get paid whatever's in the MLS, which I know some folks had used in the past. So it has to be on its face some calculation that I can, as a sort of fresh eyes, look at it and say, all right, I understand what you're going to get paid. In most cases, what I'm seeing folks expect this to look like is that, your broker will get paid up to X dollars or up to Y% of the value of the home. In some cases, it might be a fixed amount. I will get paid X dollars, period, not an up to. And then I've heard some folks thinking about whether they want to make it an entirely new arrangement that hasn't been used more as commonly, things like an hourly arrangement or a per showing arrangement. I've heard that folks are thinking about that as well, and all of that would be compliant with this term in the agreement. And as Stuart said, it could be a separate contract. It doesn't have to be part of a buyer representation agreement. It could be separate, but you have to bear in mind that you still have to comply with your duties under state law in your contracts with clients. And you can't just simply waive those obligations under your license to serve as a fiduciary, to serve as an agent when you're serving a client.
Great. Thank you very much. It also says that you must state conspicuously that commissions are fully negotiable and not fixed by state law. I think our current buyer agreements have that already in those from the Tennessee Realtors forms. It must state conspicuously that the buyer's broker may not receive compensation for brokerage services from any source that exceeds the amount or rate agreed to in the agreement with the buyer. So, Brian, do you have any further comment? That's pretty clear to me. So,
Yeah, the one question that I've heard folks ask is, well, what if we amend the contract later on? So, we start off and we say that I'll earn X%, and it turns out that in the end I want to be able to make X plus 1%. As long as your client amends the contract and agrees to it, because it's a contract, you both have to agree to any amendments. That's permissible. The key is that your client understands it and has agreed to it.
Great. And then we've also had questions about what conspicuously means. So that just means it's got to stand out. So neither Brian nor I are fans of all caps because it's hard to read, but bold, larger type, a prominent color, something that stands out conspicuously. So it's pretty straightforward. So let's move on to the next one. So elimination of offers of compensation in MLS. So it's going away in RealTracs, folks. And I mean, gone, totally gone from RealTracs. So this is pretty serious. This is not like having the wrong school district or zip code. This is something that RealTracs is legally bound to the terms of this settlement. And so we will not be permitting that offers of compensation in RealTracs anywhere. That means in the remarks, nothing in any text fields, directions, photos, photo remarks, anywhere that you might put a code. We've had folks say, can I advertise a compensation offer of compensation on my rider sign? Sure. Just don't put it in MLS. Can I cut the grass or vacuum the carpet with an offer of compensation? Sure, just don't put it in MLS. So you can do whatever you want to outside of MLS, but we are not going to have offers of compensation in the MLS. To that end, the enforcement will be tough. This is not in RealTracs DNA. Our rules that we like to enforce deal with data accuracy and timeliness, but this one's different. So the first offense, though, we are going to move into this gently. We're going to remove the material and notify the broker and agent. Second offense, we're going to delete the listing and notify the broker and agent. The third offense, we'll delete the listing, suspend access to ad edit for 30 days and notify the broker and agent. So if you come back after 30 days of being banned from editing listings, you will have your access to the system suspended for 30 days and a $5,000 fine. Now, I heard an audible gasp, even though I can't hear anything from you all. But that is the case. This is that serious. So the fine will stay with the agent. So if they want to, in certain situations, people will try to duck things by moving to a different brokerage. That's not going to happen here. So your system access will be restored after that 30 days and the payment of the fine. Fifth offense is going to go to the board of directors. They'll determine the penalties. It will definitely not be less than the fourth offense. And so it's going to get really serious at that point. I don't like to be in this position. This is not, doesn't match our customer happiness mantra. But again, this is pretty serious, and we're going to take it seriously. The good news, or part of the good news, is that the settlement agreement specifically allows for seller offered concessions in RealTracs. But there is a caveat. So as long as they are not limited to or conditioned on the retention of or payment to a cooperating broker, buyer broker, or other buyer representative. So Brian, do you want to elaborate on that caveat?
Right. So the idea is the MLS can have a concession field, but it can't just simply be a renaming of the old field of offer of compensation. So if the seller is going to say, I'm willing to make some concessions. I'm willing to pay some of the buyer's closing costs. Great. And then leave it to the negotiation table in the purchase offer agreement or otherwise to work out what those payments might be outside of the MLS.
Okay, so we, RealTracs, are adding seller offered concessions on June the 3rd. And just to, again, reiterate what Brian just said, concessions do not equal compensation. They are not the same thing. Compensation is going away from RealTracs. So what are they? So they are communication from sellers to buyers. It is actually a marketing tool to bring more interest into the property from buyers in the marketplace. The concessions are non-binding. They are not guaranteed. So that's very different from that buyer broker commission field that was in MLS, because those were offers between brokers about a legally binding contract between the two. These are non-binding and not guaranteed. The concessions can be used for closing costs, repairs, buyer broker fees. Yes, they can be used for buyer broker fees and other expenses, but you got to look at it as a bucket. It's a bucket of money that the seller is willing to offer to buyers to help them buy their property, to market and buy their property. So the caveat again is that they cannot be exclusively tied, limited to, or conditioned for payment of buyer broker fees. Any request for seller concessions needs to be in the purchase agreement and negotiated at that point in time. Another note, the purchase agreement can specify what the concessions will be used for. So that's buyer broker fee, repairs, whatever that is. And that's going to be important for your underwriting process. They're going to want to know what the breakout is for that, for the underwriting and the financing. Brian, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, your last point's, I think, really critical. So, one of the things that NAR has gone out of its way to confirm is that, FHA, Fannie, Freddie, all the sort of backers of most loans are going to continue to operate the same way. And so as long as the seller is paying these costs directly, and it's a common practice, like paying the buyer broker fee, just like they do today at closing, they're going to consider it to be part of the same bucket and not be attributed to the cap on what they can give to the buyer directly. So remember, different bucket of funds negotiated in the purchase agreement being paid to the buyer versus the buyer's service providers, like a title and closing fee or a buyer broker fee. All of those are still going to work. And I should note that a lot of folks have said, well, what about VA loans where the buyer can't pay a broker directly at all? Well, this should address that as well. Just like today, where the seller is paying the buyer broker directly, even in a VA loan situation, this should fit as well, as long as those funds are going directly from the seller and negotiated in the purchase agreement.
Great, thank you. All right, so what's that going to look like? Here are the mock-ups, fresh off the press from yesterday afternoon at 3, which they keep changing, but we iterate a lot here. So there will be a toggle switch in when you add a listing that says advertise an offer of seller concessions on the listing report. If you select that, you will be able to put into an amount that's optional. A lot of folks have been that we've talked to, we've had lots of discussions with user groups and whatnot, and they are hesitant to put in an amount because of the confusion that is an offer of something that's guaranteed. But again, this is a marketing field, so you can put an amount in there or not. On closing, we will still have a field called total seller concessions paid. This will still be an optional field, but I will tell you that the market's going to dictate changes to this field. So as we get further into this and figure out what it is that the appraisers are blowing up your phone, and it's easier to put this information in at closing, we may be breaking this out further depending on the feedback that we get from the marketplace. What's it going to look like in the system? So this is a listing detail mock-up. So it will be here under the list price on listings. If there is no dollar amount, it would just say seller concessions offered. So to flag you, the buyer representative, to include something for their buyer in that purchase agreement. It will also be down here in the under the contract information on the listing detail page. And then on the closed listing, the total seller concessions paid field will be also in the contract information. So that's it in a nutshell about the concessions field and how that looks in RealTrax. So, and I'm pretty sure that that's what's going to roll out on June 3rd, unless we run into some other major thing. But I think we're all at a good point for that. So RealTrax does like to provide transition periods. We do this with every system release. As you know, right now we're going through a change in the listing detail page. And we always provide a way for you to see the old way of doing it and see the new way of doing it and provide that transition time in the system. So this is no different. We want to provide this transition period as best we can. It's shorter this time, but we wanted you all to have an opportunity, your offices, to transition to there not being an offer of compensation in RealTrax. So like I said, that field seller concessions offered, those fields will be available on June 3rd. It will reside at the same time with buyer broker compensation. So it gives you a time to test with sellers and buyers to see what works and what doesn't. We recommend that you pick a couple of agents or if you're, highly engaged in the buying and selling of property, then pick a couple of buyers and sellers and test these things out. See what works. See what scripts you need, what forms you need, what strategies you need, and just test. While you're testing, we're going to finalize our rules, our participation agreements, and our user agreements to comply with the settlement terms. And then on August 17th, we will be implementing all of the settlement terms in RealTrax. So that offer of compensation, that buyer broker compensation field, will go away and the new process will be in place. So I know it's a short amount of time, but it should get started now. So Brian, do you have anything that you want to add to this?
No, I think you've hit the right marks here.
Okay, fantastic. So again, your primary resource is going to be nar.realtor/thefacts. They have a lot of FAQs for agents and brokers. So if you have a question, I would check there first. Somebody has probably asked the question. And then as far as the forms go, again, we should hear some information from Tennessee Realtors about a standard form, but there are tons of buyer agreements out there for you to use or be testing with to see if when Tennessee Realtors comes out with their forms, if those actually meet your needs. So Julie Davis, our Chief Relationship Officer, is here on the line, as my parents say. And she's been monitoring the QA channel.
Yes, we have a few questions. So I'm just going to start at the top and we'll go from there. And we're going to answer all of these live. The first one is about compensation. It's the only one about compensation. So we'll just go ahead and knock it out. The question is, we have our listings on our website. We have on our listings on our website, seller offer of compensation. Can we put in the MLS a hyperlink to our website and our listing in private remarks?
My understanding is that you can link to your personal website. And if that website contains offer of compensation, that is not in the MLS. You have amended your listing. But if that website is aggregating compensation from multiple brokers, we will terminate the data feed to that data website. But if it's your website and your listings, you can display that.
Okay. Next question. If the concessions are non-binding and not guaranteed, in the spirit of true transparency, how is having that field available for the public to see a good idea? That isn't going to cause confusion on a buyer's part?
Well, if I'm a buyer and I'm scrapping for money to get a down payment, that will probably entice me to have a conversation with my buyer representative to say, what about this property? You know, they're going to help me with so I don't know that that's any different than it is now, except, you know, we're more transparent is the goal here to say, if I'm a seller, are you willing to offer something to buyers coming to the table? And if you are, then let's put it in MLS and advertise it.
Okay. Next question. Why did it say down payment is as an example for seller concessions? Are seller concessions actually able to be used for buyer's down payment?
I mean, as far as I know, that they get assistance from Brian. Have you ever heard of anyone not being able to use a concession for a down payment?
No, it's kind of like a cash back, offer, and that may affect their financing, but I've not heard of it being unlawful or prohibited by a banker.
Next question. Is the offer of concession field an amount and the amount field a syndicated field that goes out to other websites?
Currently, it will be in RealTracs and on realtracs.com to the public. We belong to an organization called REZO, which is a real estate standards organization. And they're working on a standard type of display. So we want to follow data interchange rules also before we distribute. So if we put it in a IDX feed or whatnot, it may look different from others. So we don't know the answer to that yet, but yes, our intention is to display that and distribute that to consumers through data feeds.
Okay. Brian, you'd like to know that, oh, it put me back on it. It cut me off too, just so you know. Next question. Okay, this was kind of a long one. Okay.
Hey, Julie, why don't I take a stab at summarizing this one? And
okay, you've already go ahead.
If the person's not satisfied by the answer, they can always resubmit it. So I think the gist of the question is that, their understanding correctly is that the VA, despite NAR's request, has not yet explained how they're going to address buyer payments of buyer brokerage fees, and so far are not going to change their rule that the buyer is not permitted to pay a buyer broker fee directly if they're getting a VA loan. That is still correct. The distinction that I make, and that hopefully I'm conveying clearly, and if I'm not, I apologize. The current system, so how you currently sit at the closing table when you have a buyer who's getting a VA loan, is that the seller is paying the buyer broker fee. It happened to have been negotiated, offered through the seller's broker, but at the closing table, that payment, that check, is actually coming from the seller in what I understand to be 99% of the closing tables. That can still remain the case as long as you negotiate it in the purchase agreement for the seller to pay the buyer's broker, even in the case of a VA loan. Where it gets tricky, where you're right, the person who asked the question, and for all the audience, is if the seller is not willing to pay anything towards the buyer's broker fee, or it not willing to pay the entire amount, what is left for the buyer who has a VA loan, or frankly any loan, are they able to pay it? If they're getting a VA loan, the VA rules say no. So what that does is it sort of solidifies, if you will, I think, the negotiation that has to happen for your buyer who's a VA loan recipient. And I think that negotiation is likely going to be very similar, if not identical, for anybody else getting an FHA or Fannie or Freddie loan, which are the vast majority of commercial loans. They're going to need the seller to contribute something or everything towards what they've negotiated to pay their buyer broker, because they're not going to be able to afford the house otherwise. They need to put that money towards a down payment. They need to put that money towards the move, and they've saved up all they can to afford that. They need the seller to pay those fees, just like today. And so, as I've been trying to explain how I think about it, it's very possible that the way that things happen sort of after August, mid-August this year, the checks will ultimately be the same. The flow of funds may be the same. It's just the conversations that the buyer broker and the seller broker now have to have with their clients that I think are just going to be more complicated. And that's what we're trying to think through and work through. And, to amplify Stuart's point about the concessions field, I think that's what RealTracs is trying to think through, is how can we help facilitate those conversations with the sellers and the buyers through the MLS? How can we facilitate more information about what those conversations might look like?
Okay. Next question. What if you're selling one of your listings? How does this affect seller concessions / the listing agent commission?
No differently than it does now.
Okay. Next question. Also with the seller concession field, since the Tennessee forms have not yet changed, if the seller signs off on the current listing agreement with an offer of cooperative compensation, should we enter the amount for the cooperative compensation into that field? The concessions field.
Right. So the current offer of compensation field will stay and continue to be active and used just like you have until it gets removed in August. So until then, that field, the offer of compensation field, will operate just like it has, but you'll have this additional option instead of, or in addition to, the offer of compensation, that you can also have this concession communication as well.
And just to clarify, the concessions field is not a replacement for the compensation field, just to clarify.
Right. So when it goes away, you can't just take that amount that you have in the offer of compensation field and put that in the concessions field. That's what we can't do.
Next question. Brian, can you explain to everyone the difference between the importance of the August 17th date and the November date?
Sure. Right. So there's a couple of dates, and I get why people have been confused by them, and so they've sort of fluctuated around a little bit, but they're kind of set in stone now, pretty much. And so there's 2 dates. So all the MLSs that are going to be released under the agreement, meaning they're protected from further litigation, all their subscribers who are realtors are protected from further litigation. That only works under the way that NAR has now moved the settlement agreement forward if they all adopt these changes no later than August 17th. So all the changes have to be in place, the new rules, the offer of compensation outside of the taken out of the MLS, all the buyer agreements, all the disclosures to your seller and to your buyer clients, all those have to happen no later than August 17th. The date in November has no bearing on what the MLS is doing. The date in November, November 26th, is when the court will look at the comments and the options that have been communicated from home sellers around the country and decide whether to approve the final agreement and close out the case, so to speak. That's what happens in November. So from an operational perspective, for most of the folks watching this video, for us working with RealTrax, our target date, our focus is August 17th. After that, it's just a matter of making sure everyone understands and is trained and can communicate around how to use the new system, so to speak. The November date is really just something that we're watching to make sure that everything still goes smoothly. But that's more of a true legal matter as opposed to an operational one for RealTrax.
Okay. Next up, does the seller concessions have to be a fixed amount for concessions, or can it be a percentage of the final sales price?
So this is one of those things that we discussed a lot. And because of the confusion between concessions and compensation, we opted to not allow a percentage in that concessions field out of the gate. Because we pretty much know anybody who is going to, in a month, go, what lawsuit? Is going to go, oh, I'll just put this in here. So that is one of the controls that we will evaluate probably in a year and see how that's working and see if we need to modify that to include a percentage. The builders, there are lots of folks who do based on final sales price, but as far as consumers are concerned, a percentage is not as impactful as a dollar amount. So since it is a marketing field, we want to go out of the gate with it being a dollar amount.
Okay. So it sounds like we all must have a written buyer compensation form starting August 17th. No options on that?
Correct.
Next question. Does that mean we can't put the compensation on the company website, or are we talking about just a personal website?
Okay, so the settlement agreement only deals with MLSs, RealTrax particularly here. So you can still offer compensation. You can put it anywhere that you want to put it, just not in an MLS.
Okay. If a seller concession offer amount is, say, $5,000, what is stopping a buyer from writing an offer to ask for $15,000 in the seller paid concession field of the offer?
Not one thing. That's how it works, should work, and that's what they want, is that this to be a negotiation of fees and price and compensation for both the seller and the buyer. And so there's not one thing wrong with asking more than listing price, asking more than the concessions, asking less than, I mean, it's a negotiation that will take place at the purchase agreement process.
So I don't see a question here, but just a comment. That they do not like that the concession field is optional. They are consistently finding misinformation, which makes it challenging to set expectations for sellers accurately, run comps, and confuses appraisers. The deal type is also consistently misreported, leading to additional confusion. Other MLSs I've seen have a system of checking data to close it out in MLS. I would love to see the seller concession field paid and deal type at closing be broken out, not optional, and checked by someone at RealTrax.
Yeah, and that's Ashley, thanks for that. This is a serious conversation. We spent about 30 minutes with half of our company talking about this yesterday. So if you put the wrong zip code on a piece of property, we've got 19,000 people who will call us and say, hey, this is in the wrong zip code. The problem with closing is that, number one, often the person who is actually closing out a listing does not have that information at their fingertips. And so we prefer to err on the side of accurate information if it's required. And so that we're trying to figure out what is the best closing process, but then that trickles down to, again, we have trouble right now with people closing out properties, much less closing them out accurately, much less closing them accurately with optional fields and that we can't validate. So it is a challenge. It is a problem to solve for us. And we are looking at it. We're talking with other MLSs around the country to see how they're validating that. But if it's wrong, nobody's going to let us know.
Okay, so Perry has a comment here. He says, I feel certain that the seller cannot pay or contribute to the buyer's down payment. I did receive a note from another participant that said that down payment assistance could be a RESPA violation, and we need to double check into this because oftentimes it's called a kickback and that's illegal. So we want to make sure on that we're
Yeah,
right.
Obviously none of us are mortgage originators, so probably just talk with your mortgage person and see. So
yeah. I feel like I know the answer to this, but I'll let Stuart answer it just in case. Do you have any knowledge if these same changes are going to be the same for Chattanooga that uses Flex?
I do not have knowledge of that.
Well, I mean, we do know that effectively every MLS that's owned by an association, a realtor association, which includes Chattanooga, will have the same rule changes because they're part of the settlement agreement as well. What they choose to do with their MLS system in terms of adding a concession field and what that field will look like, that may be different. But like removing the offer of compensation, requiring buyer's broker agreement, requiring disclosures, those are all going to be applied by effectively every MLS in the country.
Okay. Allowing the offer of compensation field to remain and encouraging agents to put compensation within the offer to purchase can cause a violation of Code of Ethics Standards Practice 1616 if the purchase offer is different from what is offered in the MLS. Seems that the offer of compensation field needs to disappear at the same time as concession field appears. Comment.
That may be, Philip. I'm not really sure. We just want people to have an opportunity to transition from one way of doing business to another. And that is, I highly doubt anybody's going to be filing ethics complaints before August 17th for, but if they do, then we'll deal with that then. But the most important thing is to try to help the marketplace transition.
Phil would like to know, can we reinforce in the remarks that the seller concession amount is negotiable?
Sure.
Okay, next question. If local MLSs and brokers are overseeing themselves in compliance in this matter, yet this is a national issue, who is overseeing this nationally to make sure we're not all thrown under the bus by a couple of bad actors in a different region?
I'll take that one. So I think the most direct way to answer that is, so the court will actually have oversight of all of the compliance for 7 years. And so what may happen is that if some broker that's part of the settlement or some MLS violates what they agreed to do, the plaintiffs could show up in court and move for an order of contempt, which means that the judge could issue a fine or send someone to prison for a short period of time, which is very rare. But that is the national enforcement oversight. Is actually the court being able to implement it. And so, what I'm telling MLS clients around the country is that their brokers and agents need to understand that this isn't just about MLS fees and fines, but there's the potential here that if they don't take this seriously and they try to play games around the offer of compensation, that the court could get involved.
Brian, if a seller wants to offer cooperative compensation on our personal listings on our personal websites after August 17th, can it be a percentage or does it have to follow the MLS as a dollar amount?
So the MLS won't have any rule anymore of any kind about what you as a seller or you as a seller's broker want to offer. The only rule we'll have is that the seller's broker must disclose in writing to the seller what they're offering to share. But if the seller wants to put a billboard up on the highway saying that I'm willing to, pay you $1 million to buy my house, go for it.
Okay. Any discussion of real tracks enforcing the buyer agreement being signed prior to showing, uploading on the MLS, or what about showings not via real tracks?
Okay, so the enforcement for the buyer agreement being signed prior to showing will be part of our responsibility. We do have almost 70% of the marketplace uses real track showings for their showing process. And so one of the things that we have discussed is part of the settlement agreement also requires us to educate. And so part of that education process will be in that showing, setting up a showing that you confirm somehow that you understand that you have to have an agreement signed before showing this property. That may be 3 times. It's just something for us to remind you. We will have a process to enforce that, but I'm not sure what that looks like yet. We've got to see what kind of complaints we get into, what kind of rules or that we need around that. We don't know yet. So we will be enforcing it, but that's going to be an iterative process also.
Okay, Perry says, please confirm if the seller concession field on the MLS can include the commission the seller is willing to pay. If so, are you 100% certain that this is compliant with the terms of the settlement agreement?
Yes and yes. The limitation is you can't use the MLS in any way to say that that amount, whatever it is that you're putting in the MLS, is limited to the buyer broker payment. So if the reality is that the seller is willing to pay a concession and intends for that to be used for the buyer broker agreement, that's fine. That's perfectly fine. But you have to keep in mind that that can't be communicated through the MLS. It can't be communicated through a wink, wink, nod, nod. It has to be a bucket of money that the seller is willing to offer out there, and that the buyer then comes in with a request in the purchase offer to cover certain costs that they agree to in that purchase agreement.
Okay. So Michael says, so in short, we can put the dollar amount in the concessions that correlates to the amount the seller has agreed toward buyer agent fees, i.e. $400,000 home, and seller has agreed to pay 3% on the listing agreement to the buyer agent. We would put $12,000 in that field. This is the max amount they would pay to buyer's agent, but amount for buyer concessions can ultimately be negotiated in the purchase and sale agreement if the buyer needs closing assistance in addition to those fees, as long as it's clearly defined in the PSA what the concessions are used towards.
Yeah, I mean, you can't communicate it the way that you put it into that in that question. So it can't be communicated to the buyer broker who shows up or to the in the MLS that this fee is limited to that or tied to that. But if that's what your seller client wants to offer, is to say, okay, I'm willing to to offer $12,000 towards the purchase of this home because I think that's about what they're going to pay to their buyer broker, that's fine. And then it's up to the negotiation to figure out whether the buyer actually needs $12,000 to go towards their buyer broker, if they have other costs that they want you to cover. One of the things that I've heard, and I think, for everyone watching, needs to be prepared to think through, is that most folks, I think, are actually expecting that their seller will not offer a fixed amount for the buyer's broker up front, that they're going to wait to see what the buyer asks for. And that, they're sort of expecting that most purchase offers will include a request for a buyer broker fee. And then, the seller will have to do the math with you and your advice about what's the best deal overall.
Jess says, if we add a note in the listing description that says seller offering X amount towards buyer closing costs, does it have to match the amount input in the concession field? Okay.
I don't know why you would do that, but
Right. Yeah, I mean, as Stuart said, it's a marketing field, right? It's what you're putting out there to signal to the market about your seller's willingness to pay towards the buyer's costs.
Tamara says, if our personal websites offer MLS listing searches, are you saying that you can still offer compensation on these types of websites that have MLS feeds?
okay, if you are getting an IDX feed for a listing search on your website, you can append your listings with an offer of compensation that you've negotiated with your seller. But you cannot include offers of compensation from your competitors on that website. If you do, your IDX feed will have to be terminated according to the terms of the settlement agreement.
Okay. Randy says, clarification, NAR in Tennessee will require a signed concessions agreement before a showing. Obviously, we will require one before making a purchase offer.
Well, it's a buyer agreement. The concessions is an optional part of RealTrac service offering. So there's no concession agreement per se, but the buyer agreement, yes, that will be required.
Okay. The next couple of questions are about the RealTrac's enforcement. With the fourth offense and that $5,000 penalty, what happens if that agent never pays it and leaves our brokerage? Who's stuck with that bill?
Good question, Phil. That we are not rolling this up to the broker. This is a behavioral issue with that we need to enforce at the agent level. So we do not want to penalize the broker for someone just kicking and screaming into a new way of doing business. And so they just won't be able to come back to RealTrac. You release their license, they're out in ether world, but that fine stays with them until they resurface. So, there is another issue that if a brokerage firm has a lot of these violations, we'll probably be looking at the broker at that point in time. But again, we're going to iterate through this. We assume, and we always assume at RealTrac, that everybody really does want to do the right thing here. And so that's a great place to start.
Rebecca asks, considering the significance of the penalty, do you think you will require mandatory training for new users? Do you want me to answer that, Stuart?
We're not going to require mandatory training. I mean, it is, there will not be an offer of compensation field. The information that's related to those fields, our videos on ad edit, all of that will address compensation. And so there's not going to be mandatory training. No.
I will add to that though, Rebecca, we do plan on doing a ton of training about the changes that are happening in the system between now and then and following that. And we do have a RealTrac orientation class that does address what like regulations we have, the RealTrac rules are. We touch on most of them, but there are a few that we really hit on, and this will be included in that. So know that there will be plenty of training options starting soon and going forward about this.
Oh, that's Rebecca. Hey, Rebecca.
Don would like to know, will there be anything added to the purchase sale agreement to request broker fees?
I don't know the question of that. So Addison, Tennessee Realtors Legal Counsel, that's working on the forms, I was on a panel with her sometime in the last few days. She said that there is debate on that forms committee about whether the fees should be in the purchase and sale agreement or as a separate agreement. So that's going to be on that Tennessee Realtors Forms Committee to determine that. My suggestion, my recommendation would be that if you don't like the Tennessee Realtors Forms, modify them to fit your business and what works with your buyers and sellers.
A couple other questions in regard to forms. How does this change the listing agreement? Will there be a new form for sellers agents compensation?
Brian, we're getting into forms. That
Yeah.
is not my forte. So
No, I mean, Railtracks doesn't go, doesn't handle its forms. Tennessee Realtors does. Remember, you can always customize your form with your own firm's lawyer. And so if there's practices that you want to do in terms of, clarifying language or explaining the concessions or explaining your own listing fees, yeah, work on your form.
I would say that's similar to the question Michael has. Do we foresee the state association adding the words buyer broker fees to the closing expenses field in the PSA under the buyer's closing expenses listed there? Same thing.
yeah, again, Phil Comstock's on this call. So Phil, write down these questions.
Yeah, the other thing I would just note for folks, and I've been trying to help a lot of realtor associations around the country grapple with what the new language would be. And, as hard as they're all working and creative as they're being and trying to flex, the message I keep sort of reminding them and folks like who are on the call today is just, be patient, have some grace, right? If these forms come out and it turns out that in a few months we figure out that we need to have an evolution of it again because folks are actually having a slightly different conversation than everyone thought they'd have, those forms are going to have to get updated. And maybe the system will have additional information in it. Maybe we'll tweak the field in the system. That's why we test. That's why Realtracks does this early, to get feedback and get folks thinking. But I have no doubt that these things are going to evolve.
Phil would like to know, is there anything restricting us from saying in remarks that seller concessions can be used for buyers' closing costs, repairs, and or buyer broker fees?
So I'll jump in there for now. So I think for the moment, the rule is going to be that you really can't limit the concession offer to anything related to buyer broker. And, the list that you kind of read off there is a judgment call about whether it's being limited. And so I think for the moment, we're going to try to be strict and say, you can't in the remarks say anything about how the concession is going to be used towards buyer broker fees. The reality is, just as Stuart's slide said, it can be used for a whole list of things, which includes buyer broker fees. And when you get to the negotiating table of the purchase offer, that's where you can refine what it could be used for.
Brian, will you repeat one more time what or maybe that was you, Stuart, one of y'all said about the IDX fee, please?
Okay, yeah. Hey, Paula. So you can use an IDX feed to power your website search for listings on your website. You can append your listings with offers of compensation if you agree to that with your seller, that will be offered. You can append your listings, but you cannot display or aggregate offers of compensation from your competitors on that website. And so that's the prohibition. There's no prohibition about your amending your own listings to convey that to the public, to other realtors, whatever that is. Obviously, you don't want to convey that to the public. You're trying to get buyer agents to look, bring their clients to your property. I would caution everybody just to start thinking about the way you do business differently, and try to move past this old way of doing business. So if you're just trying to promulgate the current system and work around that, that's not going to solve the problems that were brought up in these lawsuits and that the Department of Justice is still taking a look at. So it might be better just to embrace a new way of doing business as opposed to promulgating or working around whatever the terms of the settlement are just because that's the way we've always done business. And so commercial has been doing business like this forever. That the compensation is negotiated during the purchase or the lease agreement, and it works for them. And I just think that that would be the safest way to do this, because if individuals start doing it, then you've just put another target on your back for a different group of complainants.
Larry would like to know, when can an agent get their offenses cleared chart and start over, or does it go
Man,
on
Larry, you're expecting the worst. I just don't think that's going to happen. So I just don't think it's going to happen. Again, I believe the best in everybody, and I just don't think that we're going to have this issue going forward. So in 5 or 10 years, man, I don't know. We'll probably be updating systems in 10 years. So I don't know the answer to that question. Again, if this is happening a lot, we'll have to readdress it and see what. I just don't anticipate it happening. So.
Melissa has a suggestion for the person from Tennessee Forms. She would like to say that she has sample verbiage for the PSA to be included like it is for many other contingencies we have now. That's what she's asking. Perry says, thank you for answering these questions today. I know we will get through this together. You're all right, Perry, we will. Will RealTrack support provide guidance when we have questions about the correct method before posting a new listing on the MLS? Yes, Perry, our support team and our customer happiness team are here to help everybody, and they are equipped and ready.
Yes.
Last question here. On the MLS, looking up closed sales, there's currently a seller paid closing cost column. Will there be a new seller concessions to replace that? It will be helpful in easily seeing that field to run comps effectively. Yes.
I know they talked about that yesterday at our product collaboration meeting. What they call it was, let me see.
It is total seller concessions paid.
There we go. Total seller concessions paid. That'll be the title of the field.
I have one quick update regarding IDX and VAL. No compensation information is coming via IDX or VAL feeds, nor can it be aggregated from other brokerages outside your own. Doing so would cause the data feed to be pulled. So do know that. Stuart, people would like to know if you will be sharing your slide deck.
If Brian says I can, I will.
If legal says we can, we can. And I did get asked about the recording. And as long as Brian says I can share this recording, we will send it out to all the participants here, whether you registered and made it or did not.
Perfect.
Great. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I expected it to be about 30 minutes, but we had some really good questions. So, and Brian, thank you so much for being here and always answering well. And Julie, thanks for keeping us all straight. You all have a great day. Thanks so much.